Hello. A secret affair, a corrupt doctor, and a plan to deceive me, all unraveled in the most devastating way. My name's David, and I've been married to Lisa for 6 years. We met at a mutual friend's wedding, and from the moment we started talking, I was hooked. She was charming, witty, and had this smile that could light up a room. I thought I was the luckiest guy in the world when she said yes to marrying me. Lisa works as a marketing manager, and she's always been a bit of a workaholic. Long hours and late nights weren't unusual, but lately, things felt off. It's hard to explain, but it's like there was this distance growing between us. She'd come home late, making excuses about meetings and deadlines, and I'd be lying if I said it didn't make me uncomfortable. I tried not to read too much into it at first. I mean, work can be demanding, and she's always been driven. But there were little things, subtle changes, that I couldn't shake off. It all started about 3 months ago. Lisa became more protective of her phone, always keeping it face down on the table, or taking it with her even when she went to the bathroom. It was weird because we'd never had that kind of relationship where privacy was an issue. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as me being paranoid, but the feeling was there, like a knot in my stomach that just wouldn't go away. She also started talking about a new gynecologist she was seeing. At first, I didn't think much of it. I mean, everyone needs to take care of their health, right? But she'd mention him often, in passing, saying things like, "Dr. Miller is really thorough," or, "He's so professional and makes you feel comfortable." Nothing seemed off about that on the surface, but when she started going for appointments more frequently than usual, that knot in my stomach tightened. I'm not the type to jump to conclusions, but something just didn't sit right with me. It felt like there was more to the story, and I was about to find out that my gut feeling wasn't wrong. This was only the beginning of the end, and trust me, things were about to get a lot worse. So, a couple of weeks ago, Lisa came home with this huge smile on her face. It was one of those smiles that lights up her whole face, and for a moment, I felt relieved. Maybe things were finally going back to normal. I was sitting on the couch, half watching TV, when she walked over, stood in front of me, and just blurted it out. "I'm pregnant." I was stunned. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt this rush of emotions, shock, excitement, confusion, all at once. We hadn't been trying for a baby, at least not seriously. We'd talked about kids, sure, but it was always a someday kind of conversation. And now, here she was, standing in front of me, telling me we were going to have a baby. I hugged her, trying to wrap my head around the news. Part of me was thrilled. I mean, I always wanted to be a dad, and the idea of starting a family with Lisa felt like the next step. But then that nagging feeling came creeping back, the one that had been bothering me for weeks. I pulled back a little and looked at her, trying to read her expression. "How far along are you?" I asked, my voice a little shaky. "About 8 weeks, she said, beaming. "I've been seeing Dr. Miller, my gynecologist, and he confirmed everything. That's why I've been going in so much lately." And just like that, it clicked. The frequent appointments, the way she'd been so secretive about where she was going, it all made sense now. At least, that's what I tried to convince myself. I wanted to believe that this was the reason for everything, that maybe she had been nervous about the pregnancy and didn't want to say anything until she was sure. But even as I tried to let myself feel happy, there was still this little voice in the back of my head, whispering doubts I didn't want to hear. Something about the way she said, "Dr. Miller," felt too familiar. It was like she was hiding something, but I didn't want to ruin the moment by asking too many questions. So I hugged her again, and we sat there on the couch, talking about baby names and what it would mean to be parents. For a little while, I managed to push my worries aside and just focus on the idea of our future together. But as the days passed, that uneasy feeling kept creeping back in, stronger than before. I couldn't shake the thought, was there something else she wasn't telling me? A couple of weeks after Lisa told me she was pregnant, we had our first big milestone, finding out the baby's sex. We had scheduled a joint ultrasound appointment, and honestly, I was pretty excited. Nervous, too, but mostly excited. It felt like things were starting to come together, like maybe this was the fresh start we needed. The appointment was at 5:30 p.m., right after work. I planned to leave a little early to make sure I got there on time, but of course, things didn't go as planned. My boss called me into a last-minute meeting, and by the time I got out, I was already running late. I sent Lisa a quick text, letting her know I was on my way, but I could feel the anxiety building up. I hated being late, especially for something this important. I rushed to the clinic, practically running through the hallway to Dr. Miller's office. As I approached the door, I slowed down, trying to catch my breath. That's when I heard it, voices coming from inside the room. I couldn't make out everything, but I caught Lisa's voice, and what she said made my stomach twist into a knot. "Stop, don't touch me now. My husband will be here any minute." I froze, standing just outside the door. My heart was pounding, and for a moment, I didn't know what to do. The way she said it, it wasn't casual or playful. It was almost commanding. Like she was reminding someone of something they already knew. I wanted to burst in there and demand to know what was going on, but I forced myself to take a deep breath, steady my nerves, and open the door calmly. When I walked in, Lisa and Dr. Miller were standing by the ultrasound machine, both of them looking a little startled, like I had interrupted something. Dr. Miller quickly recovered, flashing a professional smile. "Ah, David, glad you could make it," he said, gesturing to the chair next to Lisa. "We were just about to start." Lisa looked over at me, her face brightening up in that way she always did when she was trying to make everything seem normal. "You made it just in time," she said, her voice a little too cheerful, like she was relieved I had finally shown up. I sat down next to her, but my mind was racing. Those words I heard outside the door kept echoing in my head. What exactly did she mean by, "Don't touch me now"? I tried to push the thought away, telling myself I was overthinking it. Maybe she was just nervous about the ultrasound and didn't want to start without me. That made sense, right? Dr. Miller dimmed the lights and started the ultrasound, his tone casual as he explained what we were seeing on the screen. He pointed out the baby's head, the tiny hands, and then finally, the part that would tell us if we were having a boy or a girl. I tried to focus, to be present in the moment, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had heard. As the ultrasound went on, I kept glancing between Lisa and Dr. Miller, trying to catch any hint of what was going on. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something between them, something I wasn't seeing. But I didn't say anything. I just sat there, smiling at the screen, pretending like everything was fine, while inside, I felt like I was drowning in questions. After the ultrasound, we left the clinic with a small, grainy picture of our baby in hand. Lisa was beaming, and I did my best to match her energy. It should have been a happy moment, one of those milestones you remember forever. But all I could think about were those words I'd overheard before I walked in, and the uneasy feeling that kept gnawing at me. On the drive home, we talked about the baby, names we liked, how we'd start setting up the nursery soon. I was trying so hard to be in the moment, to just enjoy this new chapter of our lives, but my mind kept drifting back to that strange exchange between Lisa and Dr. Miller. I didn't want to push too hard, but I needed to know more. So I decided to ask, casually, like it was no big deal. "Hey, when's your next appointment with Dr. Miller?" I said, glancing over at her while keeping my tone light. "Just so I can put it in my calendar. You know, try to make sure I don't get stuck at work again." Lisa didn't hesitate. "Oh, it's in a couple of weeks," she said, almost too quickly, like she had the answer ready. "Just a routine checkup. Nothing major." I nodded, trying to act like I was just making conversation. Good. I want to make sure everything goes smoothly. Take care of our baby, okay?" I said, giving her a small smile. "Don't miss your doctor's appointments." She laughed softly, reaching over to squeeze my hand. Of course. You worry too much, David. Everything's fine. But as I watched her smile and look back at the road, I couldn't help but wonder if she was telling the truth. Was everything really fine? Or was she just good at pretending it was? I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that all of this was just in my head, that I was letting my own insecurities get the best of me. But something about the way she answered, the way she didn't even blink when I asked, it felt rehearsed, like she had been expecting the question. I decided then that I would let it go, at least for now. There was no point in making a scene, not when I didn't have any real reason to doubt her. But I couldn't shake that nagging feeling that something was off, and I was starting to wonder how much longer I could pretend that everything was okay. The truth was, I wasn't ready to face what my gut was trying to tell me. Not yet. But I had a feeling that sooner or later, I was going to have to. It had been 2 weeks since the last ultrasound, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled deep in my gut. Lisa's cheerful demeanor hadn't changed, and she went about her day as if everything was perfectly normal. But I couldn't ignore the doubts swirling around in my head. The more I thought about it, the more I felt like I was missing something important, something I wasn't supposed to see. I knew her next appointment with Dr. Miller was today, and I wasn't supposed to be there. Lisa hadn't asked me to come, and I hadn't made any plans to join her. But as the day went on, I found myself unable to focus on anything else. I kept replaying that moment at the last visit, the way she told him to stop, and the strange, casual way she mentioned her appointments, like there was nothing to hide. Maybe I was paranoid, but I needed to see for myself. So, I left work early, without telling Lisa. I drove to the clinic, parking a little way down the street so she wouldn't see my car. I felt a little ridiculous, like some kind of stalker, but I had to know. If there was nothing going on, then I'd laugh at myself and move on. But if there was... I walked into the clinic, keeping my head down, hoping I wouldn't run into anyone who might recognize me. I didn't have an appointment, but I'd been there enough times to know where Dr. Miller's office was. My heart was pounding as I approached the door, and for a moment, I hesitated. Maybe this was a bad idea. Maybe I was making a huge mistake. But then I heard something, faint voices coming from the room, and I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't the kind of conversation you'd expect between a patient and a doctor. My hands clenched into fists, and I felt a rush of adrenaline. I pushed open the door without knocking, my heart thundering in my chest. What I saw made my blood boil. There was Dr. Miller, leaning over Lisa, who was lying on the examination chair. It wasn't a professional scene. His hands were on her, too close, too familiar, and the way he was standing, it didn't look like he was performing any kind of medical examination. Lisa's eyes were wide with shock as she saw me burst in, but before she could say anything, I felt something snap inside me. Without thinking, I stormed over to him, my vision blurred with rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted, grabbing him by the collar. Before he could respond, I pulled back my fist and swung, landing a punch squarely on his jaw. He stumbled back, hitting the wall, and for a second, the whole room was dead silent, except for the sound of my heavy breathing. Lisa screamed, jumping off the examination chair, her face pale and terrified. "David, stop! What are you doing?" she shouted, her voice trembling. But I couldn't even look at her. My eyes were locked on Dr. Miller, his expression shifting from shock to a kind of cold, calculating calm. "You don't understand," he said, raising his hands as if to show he wasn't a threat. "It's not what you think." I felt like the room was spinning. "Not what I think? You're touching my wife in a doctor's office, and you're telling me it's not what I think?" I could barely get the words out, my voice shaking with a mix of fury and disbelief. Lisa rushed over to me, trying to grab my arm, her eyes filled with panic. "David, please, let me explain," she pleaded. But I wasn't ready to listen. I was seeing red, my mind racing with all the doubts and suspicions I had been trying to ignore, all crashing down on me at once. I stepped back, pulling my arm free from her grip, trying to make sense of what I had just walked in on. My head was spinning, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear over the sound of it. And as I looked at Lisa, standing there, trying to hold herself together, I realized I was about to hear an explanation I wasn't prepared for. After that day at the clinic, everything felt like a blur. I don't remember how I got home, or if Lisa tried to talk to me again on the way out. All I knew was that I had seen enough, and there was no going back. I spent the entire night replaying the scene in my head, trying to make sense of what I had witnessed. The look on Lisa's face when I burst into the room, the way Dr. Miller had tried to act like nothing was wrong, it all felt like a nightmare, one that I couldn't wake up from. I didn't want to hear her excuses or explanations anymore. The truth, whatever it was, had been staring me in the face, and I had been too blind to see it. By morning, I had made my decision. I couldn't stay in this marriage, not after everything. I knew it would be messy, that it would hurt, but I had to do it. There was no way I could live with the constant doubt, the lies, and the betrayal. I took the day off work, telling my boss that I had a family emergency to deal with. In a way, it felt surreal, driving to a lawyer's office, like I was just going through the motions. But deep down, I knew it was the right thing to do. I couldn't let myself be strung along anymore. I had to take control of my life, even if it meant tearing everything apart. I sat down with the lawyer, a man named Thomas who looked at me with a mix of sympathy and professionalism. I told him everything, how Lisa had been acting strange, the incident at the doctor's office, my suspicions that there was something more going on. He listened quietly, taking notes, and when I was done, he just nodded. "David, I'm sorry you're going through this," he said, his voice calm. "But if you're certain this is what you want, we can start the paperwork for a divorce right away. It might take some time, but we'll make sure you get through this." I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said, my voice firm. "I want to file for divorce." Thomas walked me through the process, explaining what would happen next, what to expect, and how we would handle things like the house and finances. It was overwhelming, but I felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted off my chest. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was making a decision for myself, instead of just reacting to whatever Lisa did. When I got home, I found Lisa waiting for me. She must have known something was up, because she was pacing the living room, her eyes red and puffy, like she had been crying. The moment I walked in, she rushed over to me, her voice shaky. "David, please, we need to talk. I can explain everything." I cut her off before she could finish. "It's too late, Lisa. I've already filed for divorce." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. For a moment, she just stared at me, as if she hadn't heard what I said. Then, slowly, her face crumpled, and she started to cry. "David, please, you have to understand." "I don't need to understand anything," I said, my voice cold. "I saw enough. I trusted you, and you lied to me. I'm done." She tried to reach out, to touch my arm, but I stepped back, putting distance between us. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm pregnant, with our baby." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I didn't flinch. I had heard all the excuses I needed. "I'm not even sure what to believe anymore, Lisa," I said, my voice breaking for a moment. "You say it's our baby, but how am I supposed to trust you after everything?" She started sobbing, but I couldn't let myself be swayed. Not this time. I had spent too long trying to make sense of her lies, and now, I had to take care of myself. "I'll let the lawyers handle everything from here," I said, turning to leave. "I don't want to talk anymore." I walked out of the room, leaving her there, crying. Part of me wanted to turn back, to comfort her, to try and understand what had led us to this point. But I knew that if I did, I would be dragged back into the same cycle of doubt and deception. Filing for divorce was the hardest decision I had ever made, but I was finally starting to see a way out, even if it meant walking away from everything I thought I knew. After filing for divorce, the anger and betrayal didn't just disappear, they burned inside me, growing stronger with each passing day. I kept replaying that moment at the clinic over and over in my head, imagining all the scenarios, trying to make sense of how everything had gone so wrong. But no matter how much I tried to push it out of my mind, one thing was clear: Dr. Miller had to pay for what he did. I couldn't just let him walk away unscathed after having sex with my wife. I wanted him to face real consequences. I knew confronting him head-on would be pointless, he'd just deny everything, and without proof, I didn't have a case. I needed solid evidence, something that would not only expose him but destroy his career. So, I started looking for answers where I knew they had to be, on Lisa's phone. She had always been careful about keeping it close, but after everything had come out, I noticed she was less guarded. Maybe she thought there was nothing left to hide. One night, when she was in the shower, I took my chance. My hands were shaking as I unlocked her phone, feeling a mix of dread and determination. I started scrolling through her messages, searching for anything that would confirm what I already knew. For a while, there was nothing out of the ordinary, texts from friends, work chats, but then I found a thread with Dr. Miller, saved under a different name, Rob M. The messages were simple, almost mundane, but they said everything I needed to know. They were always the same, over and over again, today as usual, at the same time. Let me know if there are any changes. Your payment for my silence. It felt like my heart stopped when I read that last one. Payment for his silence. What the hell did that mean? I scrolled back, reading through older messages, trying to find any more clues. It was always vague, short, and to the point, like they had a routine, an understanding. But those words, payment for my silence, they echoed in my head, making me feel sick to my stomach. Silence about what? I thought I had seen it all, but now there was this new twist. Was he blackmailing her? Was there more to this affair than I had realized? I didn't have all the answers, but I had enough to know that Dr. Miller was exploiting the situation, using it to his advantage. And that was my breaking point. I wasn't just dealing with an affair anymore. This was manipulation, coercion, and it had to stop. I knew I had to act fast. The messages alone were enough to suggest a gross violation of ethics and possibly even criminal behavior. I took screenshots of every incriminating message, making sure I had multiple copies saved and backed up. I couldn't afford to lose this evidence. The next day, I reached out to a lawyer, someone who specialized in medical malpractice and ethical violations. I explained the situation, showed him the evidence I had gathered, and told him what I wanted, to make sure Dr. Miller never practiced medicine again. The lawyer listened carefully, his expression serious, and when I finished, he nodded. "David, this is enough to make a case," he said. "If we can prove that he was using his position to manipulate and exploit patients, we can file a formal complaint with the medical board. They'll investigate, and if they find enough evidence, it could lead to the revocation of his medical license. He'll never be able to practice again." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. I didn't care how long it took, or how hard I had to fight. I wanted to make sure Dr. Miller faced the full consequences of his actions. I wanted to make sure he couldn't just move on to another clinic, finding new victims to manipulate. I handed over everything, the screenshots, the details of the affair, and my account of what had happened at the clinic. The lawyer assured me that they would begin building a case, contacting the medical board and preparing for any legal battles that might come our way. As I left the lawyer's office, I felt a strange sense of calm. I knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time since this nightmare had started, I felt like I was in control again. Dr. Miller had used his position to take advantage of my wife, and he had tried to cover it up by turning their relationship into some sick transaction. But now, I had the evidence, and I was going to make sure the truth came out. This wasn't just about getting back at him for what he did to my marriage. It was about making sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. He had to lose everything, the career, the reputation, the power he had used to manipulate and betray. I was going to make sure of it. Because some things, you don't just forgive. Some things, you make sure are destroyed. A few days after filing the complaint against Dr. Miller, things started to pick up. The lawyer told me that the investigation would move forward, and I was prepared to see it through to the end. Dr. Miller needed to face the consequences, and I was determined to make sure he didn't get away with what he'd done. Then, one afternoon, I got a call from an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment, but something told me I needed to answer. When I picked up, I instantly recognized the voice on the other end. It was Dr. Miller. "David, we need to talk," he said, his voice tight and agitated. "There's more to this than you realize, and if you're smart, you'll listen." I felt my heart rate pick up, but I kept my voice steady. "There's nothing to talk about, Dr. Miller. I've already filed the complaint, and I'm not taking it back." "You don't understand," he snapped, sounding more desperate now. "It's time you knew the truth. Your wife, the baby she's carrying, it's not yours. And it's not mine either." I froze, stunned into silence. I had suspected there was more to the story, but this was a twist I hadn't seen coming. "What are you talking about?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. Dr. Miller took a deep breath, like he was bracing himself. "The child is from someone else," he said. "Lisa came to me because she was desperate. She knew the baby wasn't yours, and she needed to make sure you wouldn't find out. So she asked me to help her. She wanted me to fake the results of a DNA test, to lie and say the baby was yours." The words hit me like a slap to the face. I felt sick, like the ground was crumbling beneath me. I had been prepared for a lot of things, but not this. "And you just agreed to do it?" I managed to say, my voice trembling with a mix of shock and rage. "She didn't give me much of a choice," he said, his tone colder now. "In exchange for keeping her secret and faking the DNA test, I told her I wanted something in return. And she agreed. That's how it all started." My hands were shaking as I gripped the phone, trying to process what he was telling me. "So you blackmailed her into sleeping with you," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "And you thought you could just keep doing it, that no one would find out?" "It wasn't blackmail," he said, his voice hardening. "It was an arrangement. She needed me to keep quiet, and I had my conditions. But now, because of you, everything is falling apart. I'm losing my career, my reputation, all because you couldn't leave well enough alone." I felt a surge of fury, but I forced myself to stay calm. "So this is what you're calling me for?" I said. "To try and justify what you did? To get me to back off?" "I'm calling because you still have a chance to make this go away," he said, and I could hear the desperation creeping back into his voice. "Take back the complaint, and I'll disappear. No one has to know about this. You can still walk away, and we can all move on." For a moment, I didn't say anything. I just let his words hang in the air, letting the full weight of what he had done sink in. He had manipulated my wife, exploited her desperation, and now he was trying to use me to cover it up. But he had no idea how far past that point I was. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Thank you, Dr. Miller," I said, my tone calm and cold. "Thank you for giving me one more piece of proof. Every word you've just said is more evidence against you. So no, I'm not taking the complaint back. You're going to lose everything, and I'm going to make sure of it." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then I heard him sigh, like he had finally realized just how serious I was. "You're making a big mistake, David," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." "No," I replied, feeling a surge of grim satisfaction. "You're the one who made the mistake. You thought you could control everything, hide behind your lies. But now, it's over. Goodbye, Dr. Miller. I hung up the phone, my hands still shaking, but I felt a strange sense of calm. I knew now that the truth was even uglier than I had imagined, but at least I had it. Dr. Miller had tried to manipulate everyone around him, but in the end, he had given me exactly what I needed to bring him down. The road ahead was going to be messy, and I knew that confronting Lisa with this would be one of the hardest things I'd ever have to do. But for now, I was focused on one thing, making sure Dr. Miller paid for what he had done. He had used his position to exploit and manipulate, and I was going to make sure he never had the chance to do it again. It felt like I had been living in a storm, but finally, after weeks of chaos, the divorce was finalized. I had braced myself for a drawn-out legal battle, but in the end, Lisa had no choice but to agree to the terms. The truth was out, and she was left with nothing, no leverage, no lies left to hide behind. We went our separate ways, the marriage officially over, but the fallout was far from done. A few weeks after the divorce was settled, Lisa gave birth. She hadn't reached out to me directly, but I found out through mutual friends. I couldn't avoid it any longer, I needed to know for sure. I arranged for a DNA test, hoping against hope that somehow, everything would be proven wrong, that the child was mine after all. Maybe then, at least some small part of the life I thought I had would still be intact. The results came back, and they confirmed what I feared, the baby wasn't mine. There was no denying it now. The final piece of the illusion shattered, and it was like a punch to the gut, even though I had been preparing myself for this outcome. I thought I had steeled myself, but seeing the truth on paper hurt more than I expected. It was as if every moment of doubt, every suspicion I had ignored, came rushing back all at once. Lisa was left on her own, with nothing but the reality she had created. The lies, the deceit, the betrayal, they had all caught up to her, and now she had to face the consequences alone. She didn't reach out to me after that, and I had no intention of contacting her. There was nothing left to say. But while my life with Lisa was over, there was still one more battle to be fought, the case against Dr. Miller. After my complaint, and thanks to the evidence I had gathered, the medical board had launched a full investigation. When the trial began, I attended every hearing, determined to see it through to the end. Dr. Miller had tried to silence me, to manipulate everyone around him, but now he was the one standing in the spotlight, and he had nowhere to hide. As the trial unfolded, more evidence began to surface. Other women started coming forward, sharing their stories about Dr. Miller. Some of them described how he had used his position to manipulate and coerce them, just as he had done with Lisa. Others talked about feeling uncomfortable during appointments, about suggestive comments and inappropriate behavior that they had been too afraid to report at the time. Each testimony was like another nail in his coffin. The more I listened, the angrier I became, not just for myself, but for all the people he had hurt. It wasn't just about my own betrayal anymore. Dr. Miller had been using his power to prey on vulnerable women, and he had gotten away with it for far too long. But now, his entire career was unraveling before him, and I felt a grim satisfaction watching it happen. By the end of the trial, the verdict was clear. Dr. Miller was found guilty of multiple counts of professional misconduct, coercion, and abuse of power. He was stripped of his medical license, ensuring he would never practice again. But that wasn't all. Based on the severity of the evidence and the number of victims who had come forward, he was also sentenced to prison. For years, he had thought he was untouchable, but now he would spend the next decade behind bars, paying for what he had done. When the judge read out the sentence, I felt a wave of relief, but also a strange emptiness. This was what I had been fighting for, justice, accountability, closure, but it hadn't come without a cost. I had lost my marriage, the life I thought I knew, and I was still trying to figure out what to do with all the pieces. After the trial, I took some time to reflect. It wasn't easy to digest everything that had happened. I had been lied to, used, betrayed by the person I trusted the most, and I had to watch as everything I had built was torn apart. But I had also fought back. I had exposed the truth, held people accountable, and made sure that those who thought they could get away with their actions were brought to justice. It was a strange kind of victory, one that came with scars, but a victory nonetheless. I knew that I couldn't just go back to the life I had before, but I could start over. I could take everything I had learned, everything I had endured, and use it to build something new, something better. So, I did. I focused on my work, reconnected with friends and family, and allowed myself to move on, little by little. I wasn't the same person I was before all of this happened, and maybe that was okay. I had learned to trust my instincts, to stand up for myself, and to find strength even when everything seemed hopeless. It's been a few months since the trial ended, and I'm still figuring out what comes next. But I'm not looking back anymore. I don't know exactly where my path will lead, but I'm ready to face whatever comes, knowing that I can handle it. I survived the worst of it, and now, for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm truly free. And as for Dr. Miller, he's exactly where he deserves to be, and that's one less predator out there, preying on people's trust. Knowing that, at least, makes all of this a little bit easier to bear. Months have passed since everything came crashing down, and life is finally starting to settle into something resembling normalcy. The divorce is behind me, Dr. Miller is behind bars, and I'm slowly putting the pieces of my life back together. It hasn't been easy, but I'm learning to move on, to live without the weight of betrayal hanging over me. As for Lisa, I hear bits and pieces through mutual friends and social media. I don't go looking for updates on her, but every once in a while, her name comes up in conversation, and I can't help but listen. From what I've gathered, things haven't been going well for her. After the truth about the baby came out, the real father, the man she'd had the affair with, wanted nothing to do with her. He turned his back on her completely, making it clear he wasn't interested in being a father or a partner to someone who had lied and schemed the way she did. It was like the final blow to everything she had been desperately trying to hold on to. She thought she could control the situation, keep everyone in the dark, but in the end, her actions left her completely alone. With no husband, no supportive partner, and a baby to take care of, Lisa has been struggling. She barely makes ends meet, juggling odd jobs and relying on whatever help she can get. The life she had carefully constructed, the one she had built on deception, has crumbled, and now she's left to pick up the pieces on her own. The past is behind me, and the future is wide open. I've learned, I've grown, and I've come out the other side. That's my victory, and no one can take it from me. Bye-bye.